News, views and your opinions to start your day. This is Breakfast with Stephen Cenatiempo, 1206.
2CC.
23 to 8. One thing that we can discuss other than the scandals in Parliament, of course, is the Aged Care Royal Commission. Some would say the aged care industry has been a scandal in itself, but the Royal Commission has made 148 recommendations to reform the sector. The final report shows that too many older Australians have been let down by a system that's been under-resourced and unable to provide consistently high standards of care. The two commissioners have put forward differing views on the best way to manage and fund the system. However, the federal government has announced an initial $452 million in funding to address some of the most immediate priorities. Now, one person that has been an advocate for the aged care sector for many years and actually put together the coalition's policy that they took to the 2013 election on how to reform the aged care sector is New South Wales Senator Fierravanti-Wells, and she joins us now. Senator, good morning.
Oh, good morning, Stephen.
Was there anything in the recommendations or anything in the final report from the Royal Commission that we didn't already know?
Look, we knew a lot. What this final Royal Commission report has done is brought those stark statistics that have been a blight on the aged care sector very much to the fore. Things like 1 in 3 accessing residential or home care experiencing substandard care, 68% of residents in residential aged care facilities are malnourished or at risk of malnutrition. I mean, the statistics are all there. We know that there have been systemic problems. We know that there have been reviews upon reviews upon reviews. So that's been there for a long, long time. There are two things really, Stephen, that are critical about this report. One is, of course, that they make clear the history of why we are where we are, and that's something that I picked up as well in my submission. But very much were critical of the efficiency dividends to aged care funding and the rationing of the care that has been a feature of government policy, and most critical of recent government policy and a direct criticism of measures that were taken in the 2018-2019 budget, which of course was the last one prepared by now Prime Minister Scott Morrison. They make findings that go to the necessity for a needs-based system with a universal entitlement to aged care. So in other words, picking up the point that I made in my submission that you need care and you have to give that care when it's needed. So reconfiguring the system to one of an entitlement of care, which very much mirrors the Medicare entitlement system where rights of the individual are forefront. And they also, interestingly enough, suggest a general non-delegable statutory duty on providers to ensure that the nursing and the personal care that they provide is safe and of high quality so far as is reasonable. So that's all good, and I'm pleased because it has picked up many of the things that I suggested. I'm pleased about some of the suggestions that they've made in relation to the expanding the Medicare services. I'm pleased about the sort of opening up the ability of providers to provide just a particular type of care or general type of care, which will attract government funding, and that goes a long way to facilitating what I've called the hub model. As I said, I'm very pleased about the expansion of the Medicare services and most especially the stuff about the workforce, which is really, really important.
Connie,
go on, Steve.
Well, you've been fairly critical of your own government's handling of this, and the fact that we needed a Royal Commission, I guess, puts paid to that. How many of these 148 recommendations would have been addressed had your policy that you took to the 2013 election been implemented?
Well, I believe that if we had gone and implemented our 2013 policy, I think that we would have gone a long way to reforming the sector. Reform will take time. Reform needs to be across the whole spectrum of aged care, and this is what this report has made very, very clear, which is why our proposition at the time to tackle reform through a 5-year agreement between government and the sector, a partnership effectively between the sector and the government, along the same sort of lines as we reformed the pharmacy agreement and the whole way that we deal with the pharmacy issues, a consensus-based approach which traverses the lifespan and straddles different governments, so it does politicise the way that reform can be done. And I think that ultimately that is the best way that reform has to be done. Both sides have shied away from reform for fear of criticism in this space, and so therefore ultimately reform can only come, I think, in that way. Regrettably, whilst this was very challenging work, and I can appreciate that the commissioners were in agreement on the majority of recommendations, and they both agree on the need for a thorough redesign of the system. They both talk about governance arrangements. They both talk about a new aged care levy to deal with the inadequacy of the funding. But where they differ is on the institutional form that certain aspects of that governance should take, and also how that levy is determined. And so Commissioner Pagoni took a more independent commission model approach, independent of government, and his argument being basically that if you continue with the same failed system, you'll get the same failed results, and that's a logical conclusion. The other commissioner, Commissioner Briggs, who has a strong public service background, she advocated more for a government-led model. She argues that government have been the primary funder of aged care, and therefore she believes that we ought to reform existing institutions and therefore greater integration through the government systems, and that's also a very, very valid argument, Stephen. So I suspect that reform will be somewhere in the middle of all of that.
Are you confident that the government will adopt all 148 recommendations?
Look, they are extensive, and there has to be the political fortitude to say we are now going to do this. And given the criticisms that have been levelled at successive governments, and indeed one of the comments that the Commission did make is that aged care has often been treated by the Australian government as a low-order priority. And over the last decade, successive Australian governments have brought a level of ambivalence, timidity and detachment to their approach to aged care. I mean, those are words that are used by the Royal Commission. So, as I said, it takes a lot of political fortitude, and that is why I go back to the point that I've made before. You have to have an understanding of the sector. You have to effectively now roll up your sleeves, accept that there have been major deficiencies over a long period of time, and find that way, but find that politically appropriate way. Take the Australian public with you and make the necessary changes so that we do not continue to have the pattern of ongoing reviews and reports that go on to then quote those reviews and quote recommendations that weren't met in previous reviews. So ultimately, Stephen, it'll come down to political fortitude. But because of your heritage, I did want to point out one point that I thought was really telling. Commissioner Pagoni, as we know, he's of Italian heritage,
yes.
And he concluded his opening remarks in the report by saying this, and I think it's an important quote. He says, "Change is needed, but the change must be real. We hear often the laconic lament that the more things change, the more things remain the same." And he quotes the Sicilian author Lampedusa in the book Il Gatto Pardo, where he put the ideal the idea more cynically when a character in the novel says that everything must change for everything to remain the same. And he says, we must ensure that neither occurs in the outcome of this Royal Commission. The change must be real. It must not be more of the same or a change calculated to keep things as they are. And I think that that's very much a summary of a way forward.
I think you're 100% right, and so is Commissioner Pagoni. Concetta Fierravanti-Wells, thanks for your time this morning.